Hey everyone, this is Paul, and in this video what I want to do is explain why atheism implies moral nihilism. Now we're going to have to define these terms, especially these moral terms like moral nihilism. But before we even get started with that, I really want to point out and be clear about this. We're not saying that atheists can't do things we consider to be good. And I realize there are probably some theists out there who use a similar argument to try to say atheists can't do moral things. And this is just wrong. I mean, it's just wrong and misguided. I would say it's wrong because I'm friends with some atheists and naturalists, and they're some of the nicest people that I know. So I didn't even think I needed to address this, but there are even many philosophers who miss this point, so I got to point this out. In fact, even many atheists believe this to be true. You can check out this Nature paper that talks about this, but this isn't what we're talking about in this video. Rather, we're talking about something a lot more fundamental. Whether goodness is a coherent concept or refers to anything that exists at all, and whether atheism has the necessary grounding to promote the truth of any sort of moral beliefs. And that's what we're going to get into. So let's first talk about a few metaethical theories. I'm going to kind of simplify these a little bit. So this isn't going to be like the most cohesive view, but I want to kind of get down to the bottom of what we mean by moral truth or moral realism. So consider a moral claim like owning human slaves is wrong. The first question we need to ask is whether or not such a claim is truth apt, meaning can this claim be true at all? Is it possible that, owning human slaves is wrong could be a true statement? And if you say no, you're kind of left into this category that's called emotivism. This is, once again, it's a little bit of a simplification, but it's kind of like the idea that when somebody says owning human slaves is wrong, all they're basically saying is, I personally don't like it when people own human slaves. And this is very similar to saying when somebody says chocolate ice cream is better than vanilla ice cream, they're basically saying, I like chocolate ice cream. Not that there's any sort of reason for them that they could offer to somebody who likes vanilla ice cream why chocolate ice cream is better. Some other people see this as sort of just when people say slavery is wrong, it's just kind of like saying boo slavery, like a sports fan when they're cheering their team or booing the opposing team. They're not actually providing an argument or anything cognitively meaningful. They're just trying to kind of, and we'll talk about the manipulation part over. They're just kind of screaming very loudly to, or saying it with a lot of emotive force, but no logical force. Now, if you believe that moral claims could have the possibility of being true or false, you're left into this place called moral cognitivism, which means that moral statements could have cognitive meaning. So the next question we need to ask is whether there are some moral claims that are true. And there are some people that think moral claims have some cognitive meaning, but they're all false. And this is what's called Ayer theory. Basically, somebody who follows Ayer theory would say, if somebody says owning human slaves is wrong, they basically think, okay, that's a statement that has cognitive meaning, but it's a false statement. And likely the other side of the coin too, if somebody says owning human slaves is right, the Ayer theorist would say that's also a false statement. Wait, what? Yes, any sort of moral statement under Ayer theory is false, and that's because the Ayer theorist doesn't believe moral statements can be true, so they're all false. This is like kind of saying any claim you make about unicorns is going to be false, or any sort of first order claim you make about unicorns is going to be false because unicorns don't exist. So if somebody was to say, unicorns can fly, that statement is false if there is no such thing as unicorns. Now, someone may object to this and say, well, a unicorn is an object that could fly, so if unicorns exist, then they could fly, but that's not what we're asking. All that's doing is just kind of defining this new term into existence that doesn't have any basis in reality and just saying that if it existed, it could fly. By definition, of course it can fly. But we're asking whether or not there's a thing out there when we use the word unicorn to refer to that can fly. And if there's nothing that word unicorn can refer to in reality, then it's false that any unicorn can fly or could fly. So that's kind of the part about Ayer theory. Now, if you believe some moral claims are true, the next question we need to ask is whether or not the truth of these moral claims is objective or mind independent. Now, if you answer no to this question, you're basically left with moral relativism. Now, what moral relativism would say is when somebody says owning human slaves is wrong, what they're basically saying is owning human slaves is wrong for me and my society or me and my culture, but it's right in other societies or other possible societies. Whereas if you're a moral realist, which is if you say the truth of some moral claims is objective, they would believe, if they thought that this was one of those claims that could track truth, owning human slaves is wrong could be an objective fact just the same way 2 + 2 = 4 is. And that's kind of the really important piece. We'll talk about some of the problems with moral relativism and why I don't think this even works in terms of objective truth, because my idea is, how can it be possible that you have truth that's relative to certain cultures? We don't have this idea that, oh yeah, this scientific theory is somehow valid under this culture, but it's not under this other culture. My idea is if certain things are true, then they should be true independent of who's thinking about it or their culture or their, where they were born, these sorts of things. But that's kind of a different issue. So moral realism is the claim that some moral claims are true and other ones are false. Not just all of them are false or they're nonsense. And I would argue, you could say moral anti-realism, or what we'll talk about in a second, moral nihilism, is simply any of these other categories that don't believe that moral claims can be objectively true. So let's talk about a problem with each of these different ones, including moral realism. The first is I'm going to kind of group emotivism and error theory together because they both claim that moral claims cannot be true. The problem with this view is that under these theories is moral discourse simply becomes manipulation. Others are kind of always means to your end, as Alasdair MacIntyre says in After Virtue. Now, why is this? Well, because we tend to act as if our moral claims are true and we use language in a realist way. So what the emotivist is saying is, all of these claims are all equally valid because they're all completely invalid. But we don't use our moral claims like they're all equally valid. This would be like convincing somebody, hey, I like chocolate ice cream better than vanilla ice cream. This other person here likes vanilla ice cream, but I'm going to convince them to order chocolate ice cream because I personally like it more. And this would be like their idea. Like, I personally don't like slavery. This other person finds slavery to be fine. Neither of these claims are any more valid than not. But I'm going to try to manipulate them because I can't be honest with them. If I'm honest with them, then I would basically be saying I can't give them a good reason to change their moral view. But I'm going to pretend like I can give them a reason because I personally don't like the way that they're acting or the way that they're treating other people. Emotivists, if they're being consistent, they shouldn't be using realist language when making moral claims because they don't believe that moral language can function in a realist way. And when an error theorist makes a kind of moral claim, all they're doing is uttering a statement that is false. So they're kind of being manipulative too. This is why moral discourse under these two views basically becomes coercion, because error theorists and emotivists still often use moral language in a sort of realist sense and brush their metaethical views under the rug. Whereas if they were straightforward with their metaethical views, they would have to admit, yeah, I can't actually give you a reason. Yeah, this isn't anything more than my own personal preference. But they don't. But then again, I guess you could argue coercion isn't really strictly forbidden under emotivism or error theory. So I guess you could argue being manipulative or deceptive is par for the course. And this is where we get into sort of moral nihilism, because all you get is this very Nietzschean will to power, using others as means to your own end, trying to impose your own will on other people to get them to change their moral beliefs to be in line with your own. There's no idea of truth. It's just simply power and manipulation at this point. And I think this is the other point, right? It's begging the question for an emotivist or an error theorist to say there's anything somehow wrong with rape because it uses coercion or manipulation or power to convince someone to have sex with you, but then they're using coercion and power to sort of try and make this point, and there's no way to compare one being better or not than the other. And I think there's something deeply, deeply unsatisfactory about this, but I guess this is just sort of the reality of what happens if you take emotivism and error theory to their conclusion. Now I want to talk about a few of the problems with moral relativism. The first problem is I don't really see how this even counts as truth, because when we're talking about truth, I'm thinking at least, we're talking about whether or not this is true independent of human thought. But let's suppose that was solved. Let's look at some of the problems or some of the things that are unsatisfactory about moral relativism. James Rachels, in his influential paper, The Challenge of Cultural Relativism, claims that these are the following three problems with cultural relativism that eventually lead it to be false. And I'd argue rather, these are just issues that make it unsatisfactory. The first is that you can't say the customs of other societies are morally inferior to your own. So Rachels gives the example of when China is suppressing freedom of expression with Tiananmen Square, the way some cultures treat homosexuals. You don't get to condemn this anymore because that's a different culture and you're not able to criticize another culture outside of your own. The second problem is you can't criticize your own society's moral code either. And Rachels gives the example of a resident of India who wonders whether their country's caste system is morally correct. What Rachel says is all she has to do is ask whether this system conforms to her society's moral code. If it does, then there's no way it can be wrong. And lastly, there's no such thing as moral progress. I'll talk about this in a second. So Rachel's right from what he says, look, we think that at least some social changes are for the better. For example, throughout most of Western history, the place of women in society was narrowly defined. Women could not hold property, they could not vote or hold political office, and they were under the almost absolute control of their husbands or fathers. Recently, much of this has changed, and most of us think of this as progress. But if cultural relativism is correct, can we legitimately view this as progress? Progress means replacing the old ways with new and improved ways. But by what standard can a cultural relativist judge the new ways as better? And he continues, If the old ways conform to the standards of their time, then cultural relativists could not condemn them. After all, those old ways or traditions had their own time and place, and we should not judge them by our standards. Sexist 19th century society was a different society from the one we now inhabit. Thus, a cultural relativist could not regard the progress that women have made over the centuries as being real progress. After all, to speak of real progress is to make the sort of transcultural judgment that cultural relativism forbids. And Rachels continues saying, look, to take another example, we all want to condemn slavery wherever it occurs, and we all believe that the widespread abolition of slavery in the Western world was a mark of human progress. Because cultural relativism disagrees, it cannot be correct. So this is Rachels' point, and once again, I think this shows what's so deeply unsatisfactory about cultural relativism. So it seems like moral realism would be the right answer, right? Well, not so fast. The main problem with moral realism is that it's just tough to justify. And as we're going to see, it actually ends up contradicting atheism and naturalism more generally. The first is just there have been a ton of books arguing that we can explain our moral intuitions without needing any of them to be true. And thus, under naturalism at least, by Occam's razor, many say we should just discard them completely. I mean, think about it. What moral realism is proposing is what I would argue are two very controversial claims. One is the ontology of moral facts, like there are these magical things that just exist out there that are somehow true or not. But the second is actually the epistemic piece, which may be even more difficult to justify. How is it possible that we come to know these facts? Both of these things need to be accounted for or supported for moral realism to be true. So let me give you an analogy. Consider vision. For me to be able to make factual statements about things like trees, first of all, trees must exist, but there must be more than trees for me to be able to have anything like a knowledge about trees. We also need some sort of visual system we can trust that gives us accurate visual information that counts as knowledge. If we can't trust our visual system, we have no way of knowing anything about the external world from this particular sense. And similarly, if you consider a moral compass, for a moral compass to work and point to objective features about the world, we need two things. The first is you actually just need moral truth to exist out there. This is sort of like the magnetic fields that a compass would track. But that's not enough. You also need the compass to be able to point to these magnetic fields. It needs to have some sort of way of tracking it, so to speak. And the question is, how is it possible that our moral faculties are tuned in to receive these moral truths that exist out there? And it is for this reason that I think many atheists and naturalists are so skeptical of the idea of moral knowledge. And I think they're very justified in their skepticism here. Famous atheist J.L. Mackie writing, look, quote, "We have no philosophically satisfying account either of the existence of such things or of how we could come to know about them. Therefore, we should not believe in objective values." With this in mind, I think going forward, I'm only going to be considering the ontological or the moral fact piece, like the magnetic field piece. But keep in mind, even if the naturalists can posit the existence of moral facts, they still need to explain the second part, the epistemic part, how we come to know them. And at this point, we would say, look, it would be a really big coincidence that natural selection somehow caused our minds to arrive at moral truth or have some sort of capacity for doing so. And this becomes an even bigger concern when we don't have an entity like God who can intervene or create a conscience or a soul that could, in principle at least, track moral knowledge. So let's go ahead and take a second. Let me first look at naturalism. So naturalism is going to claim that all spatio-temporal entities must be identical to or metaphysically constituted by physical entities or somehow described by science. And this, of course, implies atheism because God, not being a physical being, would not exist under naturalism. So the first challenge to this view is G.E. Moore's open question argument. And the first thing we need to do is understand what an open question is. So let's start with an example of a question that's not open. The question, is 2 plus 2 equal 4, is not an open question because 2 plus 2 is logically equivalent to 4, and all we're simply asking is, is 4 4? And this is not an open question because this statement is obviously true. It's a tautology. Once you reduced an open question to some form like this, is A, it becomes a closed question because you get something of this form which cannot be false. So to Moore, a question is closed or just simply not open if both sides can be reduced to the same thing, because in that case, the answer, at least in this type of question, cannot be no. Now, Moore's point is, suppose that moral realism is true and consider the question X is good, where X is some natural property in question, like human flourishing. If that's the case, then we should be able to replace good, wherever we use the word good, with X and have the same thing. But what Moore wants us to do is look at the question, is it true that X is good? And really his point here is, if this is an open question, then it is not the case that goodness and X are the same thing, because this question should reduce to a closed question, but what Moore is going to argue is it doesn't. So his argument would go like this. Premise 1, if X equals good, then the question, is it true that X is good, should be meaningless. But the question Is it true that X is good is a meaningful question where X is, of course, some natural property. So therefore, goodness is not reducible to any natural property because this is not an open question. You end up getting a contradiction. Hopefully this is pretty clear. You could kind of ask, well, what kind of scientific test could you do to find out whether or not this thing was good? Obviously, the idea of goodness or the word goodness somehow captures something more than what we can reduce to naturally. And that's, I think, the first problem that we're going to have with these sort of naturalistic or atheistic theories of morality. Now, one thing to note that this actually works for divine command theory as well. Because we can ask the question, is it true that God's commands are good? Because this is a meaningful question, this would show that God's commands can't define what is good. However, divine command theory is not the way that theists or Christians have typically or even historically seen morality. What they've done is they've defined goodness in terms of God's nature. So this is how theists get around Moore's open question argument. The question, is it true that God has a good nature, would not be an open question because God is goodness himself. And to look more at this, you can look at Aquinas, and there's at least, I think, 23 Bible verses that say something similar to this. And what theists are going to say is, if God exists, then his nature serves as a ground for good, which solves the grounding problem and also provides an objective supernatural teleology, which gets around Moore's problem and then also Hume's problem, which we'll talk about here in a second. Well, how can we get around Moore's question? Because this seems to be a problem for any type of morality. One of the things we're going to ask is, what the heck is goodness? Well, many people think that moral claims have a sort of prescriptive nature, an oughtiness, or a to-be-doneness. And that's actually one way you can get around this, is to say moral claims are prescriptive and natural claims are descriptive. So when I'm saying X is good, I'm saying you ought to do X. And when I'm saying Y is evil, I'm saying you ought not to do Y. So somebody who's convinced by this idea that moral claims are basically prescriptive in nature would basically say, is it true you ought to do what is good? This would not be an open question, because if goodness reduces to just what you ought to do, then these two are the same thing and this is not an open question. So basically what you end up getting is this idea that if atheism is true, everything can be described by science. Science can only tell us what is, not what ought to be. Now, this is Hume's famous is-ought distinction. And thus, if everything can be described by science, there cannot be any objective ought claims. If there are no objective ought claims, then moral realism is false. And therefore, if atheism is true, then moral realism is false. You don't get to ground the existence, the ontological piece of morality, in something like God's nature. If this ontological piece of oughts requires something supernatural, you can't get it from atheism, or you can't get it from naturalism, would be the way this argument would kind of go. So there's two versions of this argument that I think are pretty clear, that hopefully show where the argument would go. The first is, look, if moral statements are true, then objective ought-based claims exist. Premise 2 would say if objective ought-based claims exist, then naturalism is false. This is Hume's is-ought distinction. And then the first conclusion, if naturalism is true, then moral realism is false. Then we basically say, look, if moral realism is false, then moral nihilism is true. And therefore, if naturalism is true, then moral nihilism is true. The second version of this argument is based on Moore's open question argument, and it goes like this. Premise 1, if naturalism is true, then moral claims cannot be reduced to natural physical phenomena. Premise 2, if moral realism is true, then moral claims cannot be reduced to statements about natural phenomena. And then as a result, if naturalism is true, then moral realism is false. And using the premise from the previous argument, if naturalism is true, then moral nihilism is true. And lastly, you can take these kind of natural arguments and turn them into an argument around atheism. You can say, look, if God does not exist, there is no grounding for the ought-based nature required for objective moral values to exist. If there is no grounding for objective moral values, then moral realism is false. If moral realism is false, then moral nihilism is true, and therefore, if atheism is true, moral nihilism is true. And perhaps one of the ways you can kind of turn this question around is just saying, look, if God's nature isn't going to ground moral truth, what the heck is? Once again, we can say that goodness exists if and only if God exists. So if God does not exist, which is of course what atheism asserts, there's no such thing as moral truth, and thus moral realism is false and moral nihilism is true. Now let's go over a few possible objections that I think are worth mentioning. The first one, I think this is perhaps the most obvious one, is just saying, look, is God's nature good is an open question. And obviously the theist is going to argue this is not the case, in part because they see God as that, which is the source of goodness. But I can understand why somebody would be skeptical of how goodness comes from God's nature. But this is a topic for another video. This is one on divine nature, because this kind of misses the point. If this succeeded the way somebody posing this thinks it would, all it would show is that moral nihilism is true whether atheism or theism is true. So it would still be the case that atheism implied moral nihilism by the previous previous types of arguments. It would just simply say that theism needs to do more work to solve the grounding problem. In this case, if this question actually succeeded, or this argument succeeded to say, is God's nature good, was an open question, basically whatever grounds goodness is an open question for the naturalist or atheist, which would still be true regardless of whether the atheist thinks God is a suitable grounding under theism. Second question I often hear is, well, why should I do what is good or what I ought to do? Now, notice how this is a different question though, and arguably a red herring. It's asking for a practical reason for morality, not a logical one. The question we're asking is whether moral obligations exist, not whether or not one cares enough to follow them. This is like asking when someone presents a proof, why should I care about math? Or more generally, why should I care about what is true? Now, I think it's a fair question, but it's a different question, and one that in my view would need to come down to practical reasons, not the kind of logical reasons we're asking about here. I'm kind of assuming that people care about truth and finding the right answer here. This is a different type of question, which is the sort of actual behavioral piece of it. The third question you may hear is, well, why does it matter if, as I'm going to claim, atheists can be just as good as theists? And my response to this is what we believe actually matters. This is what I believe. To claim it doesn't matter is like saying it really doesn't matter whether one's an atheist or a theist at all. And I'm sure, many atheists at least claim that it matters that they're an atheist, at least perhaps it does. So to me, I think our beliefs matter more than just what the effects of them are, and having true beliefs is somehow better than having false ones. Still, I think the fact that many Christians do not live their lives as if Christianity is true is a serious problem, and one that I think Christians need to take very seriously. I mean, I think there's something to be said of the atheist who goes up to the Christian and says, well, hey, wait a minute, if you believed all this stuff, shouldn't your life be just radically different? Shouldn't this change every single facet of your life? And which I would say, yeah, I think it totally should. Still, I think the question that I'm asking isn't strictly about behavior itself. It's about the rationalities of beliefs and the subsequent rationality of actions under a given set of beliefs, not about just the actions themselves. Fourth is kind of a question. So am I saying that atheists can't know right from wrong? No, I think Christian theism says that everyone has some idea of what is right or wrong, even non-Christians and non-Jews. The question comes down to whether atheism can square this belief with atheism itself. Is atheism consistent with a belief in objective morality? And for the reasons I've given, I'm going to say no, you can't get a rational justification of good if you start out with not God. Perhaps another way to say this is, look, obviously, or hopefully, the atheist has some reason for their disbelief in God. Now, in pretty much all cases, especially in the Western world, this also leads to a disbelief in goodness, perhaps because goodness has traditionally been conceptualized as coming from God or God's nature. And once again, I would say check out the results of naturalists or atheists like Richard Joyce for a really compelling, I'd argue a compelling explanation of why goodness is just kind of not the kind of thing we can account for and perhaps should be really skeptical of. The next question you sometimes hear is, well, what about human rights or some sort of harm-based morality? Isn't my experience of harm somehow give me some experience that gives me knowledge that harm is something that ought to be avoided? And I would say each of these things are trying to get an ought from an is. Perhaps I'll make a separate video on each of them and why I think they fail. But I think the main problem with harm-based morality is I think you could buy the argument that me experiencing pain is me experiencing something that I don't want to happen. But at the same time, that's not enough of a robust reason for me to care about somebody else's experience with pain that I don't firsthand experience myself. So this doesn't quite get you to the robust type of moral realism that people want to have, where people have some sort of obligation or duty to their fellow being. So I would say this doesn't really quite get off the ground, although I kind of understand the appeal here. And then the last question is, well, perhaps science will eventually tell us what we ought to do. And this is the view of people like Michael Shermer. And I can kind of see their point. I mean, it's kind of like saying, look at all the wonderful things science has achieved. Why shouldn't we hold out for an eventual science of morality? Now, my response to this would be to say, well, people have tried to define morality with science over the past several centuries and have failed each time. And basically, all they've done is basically ended up debunking our moral values. Remember, some of the previous books like Richard Joyce. For an interesting look at this, I'd say look at Hunter Nedelisky's book, Science and the Good, The Tragic Quest for the Foundations of Morality. Basically, by the same inductive principle that would lead one to think that science could, in principle, answer this question, the continued failures, despite what I would say are valiant efforts from people like Bentham and Kant, should perhaps cause people to stop trying to look for an answer for science, just as many people have given up trying to make, a time machine or a perpetual motion machine or these other types of things. And regardless, this is just a huge argument from ignorance. But notice how arguing against it is not. The is-ought gap tells us we have good reasons to suggest that value propositions under science are not of the same kind, which basically points out that what people are pursuing under this scientific paradigm is something that accounts to a category mistake. Suppose, for instance, that every single electron, if you zoomed in enough, had, slavery is wrong spelled out in every single language. I still don't think this would be enough to tell us we ought not to have slaves. That's just still an is statement. There needs to be more to get to this robust type of moral realism to really say slavery is wrong and we have sort of knowledge of this. And think about it, right? What kind of scientific experiment would allow us to just discover something like a value proposition? That would be like saying, well, what kind of scientific experiment could we do to just discover the number 2 in the natural world? Hopefully you would see why this is kind of absurd. The number 2 is an abstract object that can't be found in the natural world. So trying to use science to, find it is kind of like looking for water in the desert. And this is why, at least personally, I'm not holding my breath for science to provide such an answer to these types of questions. So anyway, thanks for watching. I'll put up a couple references here. If you have any other questions, let me know, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.